Hello and welcome everybody to what promises to be a fascinating conversation today between Rachel Herzing and Damien Sojoyner. The title of today's event is The Beautiful Struggle, Abolition and the Prison Industrial Complex. My name is Yusuf Al-Balushi and I teach in the Department of Global and International Studies here at UC Irvine. Today's event is part of our launch of a year-long Sawyer seminar at UC Irvine, supported by the Mellon Foundation. This year's Sawyer seminar theme is Black Reconstruction as a Portal. And the seminar is going to take up W.E.B. Du Bois's crucial study, Black Reconstruction in America, as a conduit to our present global crisis. Our next event in this series will be a talk by Antonio Tomas of the University of Johannesburg, who will be putting his research in conversation with Du Bois. He has a recent book on the life of Amilcar Cabral, who he's going to place into conversation with Du Bois's work. And that will be a hybrid event held on Wednesday, November 16th. So look out for more information about that event on our website at blackreconstructionasaportal.org. We want to thank Amanda Swain and Ekua Arhin of the UCI Humanities Center, as well as our postdoctoral fellow, Marilyn Grell-Brisk, and our PhD student fellows, Temitope Famodu and Mariel Rowland, for all of their help putting today's event together. Rachel Herzing is a member of the Center for Political Education's Community Advisory Board, and I believe this Center for Political Education held kind of popular study of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, so I'm sure we'll hear more about that today. She's also a co-founder of Critical Resistance. Rachel has been an organizer and educator for the abolition of the prison industrial complex and for community-based interventions to interpersonal and state-based harm. Damien Sojoyner is an associate professor of anthropology at UC Irvine. He's the author of First Strike, Educational Enclosures of Black Los Angeles, and of the very recently released, I believe this month, Joy and Pain, a story of Black life and liberation in 5 albums. So with that, I will turn it over to Damien.
Hello, thank you all for joining us today. We are super excited about this event, as Yusuf has said, and I've been wanting for a long time to be in conversation with Rachel Herzing. So I'm really looking forward to learning from Rachel, and importantly, to being able to learn from each other as we share and learn more about processes that both have led to the development of the prison industrial complex and also abolition efforts against the prison industrial complex as well. The way that the format is going to unfold is I'm basically going to ask Rachel a bunch of questions. So this is a position that I've been wanting to be in for a while because Rachel is simply brilliant. And I thank you for sharing your time and space with us this afternoon/night where you are as well.
Thanks so much, Damien. Grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to everybody who's been working on this seminar. Special thanks to Marilyn for all the help I got there too.
All right, so I'll kick it off with the first question, Rachel, which is over the past 5 years, there have been numerous terms and phrases to describe something closely related to what you describe and define as the prison industrial complex. As an opening sort of grounding question, why do you use the term prison industrial complex?
So when I use the term, what I'm talking about is a symbiotic relationship between both public and private interests that use surveillance, policing, imprisonment, sentencing, execution, kind of the whole spectrum of things that make up what we sometimes think of as the criminal legal system or the punishment system, uses those things as remedies to what I think are more properly understood as social, political, economic inequities. And in doing so, understands those responses as the kind of legitimate responses to dealing with any kind of situation that might come up. So I use it in part because I think it highlights the complex nature of all of those systems and that symbiotic relationship. It doesn't focus simply on imprisonment or simply on policing. And I think it also, we draw from the phrase the military industrial complex when we use that. I believe the term was first used by Mike Davis, but many people have used it since. And I find those resonances between the military industrial complex is kind of encroaching use of the private sphere by the public sphere, where everything gets kind of driven into the same funnel, regardless of the problem. I feel like there are a lot of parallels there, although they're obviously two separate systems. So, I mean, for those reasons, I think it is still the best term. I don't use carceral state. I feel like that's too limited to talk about the breadth of things. I don't use the criminal legal system these days because I try to avoid anything that allows us to use the legal as legitimate in the description of it. So for me, this works really, really well. And I know people have tried to screw with it and make it seem like it's only about privatization, but I still find it to be dramatically more useful than most anything out there. I think, obviously anything works. I choose this thing for those purposes, but I also don't, I'm not going to be too precious about language either. I think if we can communicate across those different phrases, we're doing just fine.
And I know that this issue has been rehashed again and again, but for some in our audience who may not know, can you talk about and discuss those dynamics with regards to privatization, in particular of understanding and teasing out the nuances of privatization within the prison industrial complex, but importantly, the notion of like the public writ large, like public funding, taxes, things of that nature as well.
Yeah, I think that I don't know. I'm trying to think of the best way to respond, the most concise way to respond to that, because you're right. It has been greatly hashed over. I think where I'll start is that the private sector of imprisonment and policing in particular, those are the kind of two big winner parts of the prison industrial complex that get the most attention when they get privatized. They still make up an incredibly small amount of the prison industrial complex, something like less than 10%. I know that is different if you think about migrant and immigrant detention. I know that that's a different animal. I'm talking about, kind of the things I was just describing. And I know that there are, lots of overlaps there, but for the sake of, answering your question in a discrete way, that's a negligible in some sense percentage when we compare it to everything else out there. So that's one thing I think to note. The other thing is that the question of whether or not imprisonment or policing are privatized and the kind of focus on that as the issue, I think diminishes from the kind of overall harms of the prison industrial complex and suggests that somehow if they were public, they would be all right. In fact, there are some people over the years who have organized against private imprisonment, suggesting that it's a public good, that imprisonment is a public good. And the crime, if you will, so-called, is that it's privatized, not that people are locked in cages, not that there's kind of a systematic deprivation of people from their liberty and their communities in very disparate ways, but the privatized nature of it, that a corporation runs it rather than a county, for instance. And then I think, the other thing that it does is it does diminish our attention on how much of the system actually is run by public entities, municipalities or counties or states or the federal government, for instance. And, a lot, and the resources for that come from our tax base. And so things that we could be funding like really good schools or public housing or libraries or parks or whatever, wind up having to compete with caging people or policing people. And I think that really is a testament to the priorities of these different scales of the state, right? The priorities around imprisonment, superseding the priority on education, a priority on what we know actually brings safety to communities, or a priority on green space, or whatever the case might be. So those are some of the features of it. I'm sure there are many people out there who could probably here tonight who could give you a much more eloquent and nuanced discussion of that. But I think those are some of the key features that I believe you're probably interested at when you ask that question.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And to your point, this has been discussed, but amazingly, it still keeps coming up. Like this myth is pernicious in that way, that it has not sort of subsided, even though people have been saying like we need to completely reframe what we understand about private. So thank you very much for taking the time to sort of draw out this notion of private versus public and its importance to discussion. The first time that I heard the phrase abolition used in conjunction with prisons, and specifically the prison industrial complex, was at the 1998 Critical Resistance meeting at UC Berkeley. And I mention that to say that a lot of what I have learned about the abolition of the prison complex, industrial complex as a praxis, was largely informed by you and your colleagues at Critical Resistance. And for that, I am forever in your debt. So thank you very much. In the roughly 25 years since that conference, the invocation of abolition as a concept has been employed in a variety of ways, ranging from academic settings to social media and other forms of popular consumption. And so once again, think about these grounding questions. Can you please situate what the abolition of the prison industrial complex was during that time period in which Critical Resistance was developing strategy, and how, if at all, you have seen it change?
Well, I should say firstly that I was not one of those people who coordinated that 1998 conference. I did attend it and was influenced by it, as you were, Damien. So I can't say what was on their minds at that point when the conference was coming together. I have heard retroactively that there was a sense that there was a bit of a lull in the anti-prison movement, or the prisoners' rights movement, it's been called. And there was a need to take stock, in 2000 or 2001, I can never get this year right, the prison population topped 2 million for the first time, and it was a big deal. And I think people could see the kind of march up to that big number. We could see, those of us who were paying attention to those things at the time, I think, could also see that the movement had really been constrained in a lot of ways. The 80s and 90s were really, really rough on the movement. And it seemed to me that this conference in 1998 offered a spark, offered a reignition, if you will, of some of the momentum that had been building, to that point. And it was a very lively setting, if you'll recall. There was a lot happening, but it was also a very kind of nostalgic kind of setting for, I think, for a lot of people too. I heard lots of stories of people encountering each other after decades, people who hadn't seen each other for decades, encountering each other in the halls, people who had gotten out of prison, seeing people they had written to or who had organized or litigated on their behalf. All kinds of new organizing opportunities and plans and schemes got hatched out of that conference too. So I think it did propel things in that way. I started working with Critical Resistance on the East Coast in New York, the very end of 1999, to start scheming a regional conference in New York City. And I will say, for our part, that those schemes were largely inspired by the 98 conference. And we also wanted to think about what would be useful where we were. And the region that we talked about, the Northeast region, which went from Washington, D.C. all the way up to Maine and as far west as Pennsylvania. And we wanted something that reflected the regional nature of the prison industrial complex and also the regional fights against it. And so, there were things like the imprisonment of Mumia, for instance, which looms very, very large on the East Coast, and other political prisoners who had been locked up in New York State prisons, for instance. The issue of policing was very much more, I think, on our minds than I got the sense it was on the 98 conference planners' minds. And so we very intentionally integrated ideas about the abolition of policing into this conference as well. And so to situate, what we were thinking about strategically and politically in that period, I would say some of that was regional in scope. So during this same period that we were planning this conference, some of the people who had planned the initial conference also began fighting a prison in the Central Valley of California, a prison called Delano II. It's called something else. They ultimately built it, but colloquially we called it Delano II. It's right across the street from another maximum security prison, and that was based a lot on kind of what was happening in the state of California, the prison building boom in the state of California, while where we lived, things were not kind of in the building scheme the same as in the state of California, even though there are a lot of things that were similar. So some of that was regional. But I also think we were looking at the wake in New York City. We were looking at the wake of police violence cases like that of Amadou Diallo's or Abner Louima's or Sean Bell's, right? These really, really took up a lot of space, at least in New York City, and really shaped how people thought about the role of policing, what policing should be for. And there were all of these openings, after the so-called cleanup of Times Square under Rudy Giuliani, that really dominated a lot of the thinking, and because we were based in New York, dominated a lot of our thinking as well. So that's some of the stuff I think that was present in my early days with the organization. And then I think a lot of the development over time, in my experience, really did evolve out of the expansion of the organization to be a national organization. So it wasn't just the concerns of people in the Bay Area of California and the concerns of people in New York City, but became also the concerns of people in the southern region, particularly in New Orleans, Louisiana, Atlanta, Georgia, across the state of Florida. And then, as the organization grew over time, the concerns of the people of Los Angeles or of the people of Kentucky or of Chicago or of Portland, right? Where the chapters started to be developed, then we had to figure out, how does the prison industrial complex move and look in these places? What are the appropriate ways to fight it? Is it contiguous or continuous in how it operates, how it shapes itself? Or are these kind of regional specificities worth paying attention to? And I believe ultimately we decided they were, because we stayed kind of regionally focused for many years out of a chapter-based model. I believe the organization still does today, although I haven't worked with them for years now. I don't know if that gets at what you were asking about. That's some of how we developed, but I think, the response was also modulated in part by what the specific needs were of the places where we decided to put down roots. And those were different place to place.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. It definitely did get to the heart of the question. And sort of building off of that, you describe how critical resistance went about in terms of building, and a lot of that you can consider to be movement building or like a movement campaign building. You, as a masterful organizer and a thinker and a strategist, you have explicitly stated that politics has to be connected to movement building. Can you explain the importance of situating the political next to movement building?
Yeah, you don't have any change if you don't have movements. I think it's really as simple as that. If you don't have movements that are willing to enact good ideas, then they just remain good ideas. They don't wind up taking shape and being able to transform conditions. So you need people who are willing to kind of put ideas into action and test them out, and then come back and say, okay, we tested this out, we have to make this adjustment. Can you give us new ideas? And then, put them back out and test them out again. It really is the proving ground, or the testing out of ideas or theories that the movements are good for. And without strong movement organizations working together to test those things out, I don't really see the point to it. Otherwise, it's like kind of pure theorization. And, I see a point to theorization, but it's a very, very different one from trying to enact change. So unless you're interested in kind of ideological games or ideological puzzles or whatever, then you need people who are willing to go out and put your things to work. And hopefully there's a little bit of overlap between the thinkers and the doers there, right? That's when they work best, when they're not kind of completely separated from each other. And I think sometimes there's a misdesignation, I can't think of the right word, but like a misdesignation that there's a separation between thinkers and doers. And I think the strongest movement have thinkers who actually get to work testing things out. And they also have doers who are, pretty high level theorists. And those people don't necessarily have to exist inside of the academy to be high level theorists. But many of them also do exist inside the academy, or have roles to play inside of the academy as well. I guess that's what I mean, though, is that I think those things have to be in what fancy pants language, a dialectical relationship with each other.
And with regards to politics and organizing against state repression, one of the more contested terrains has been around Blackness. And we have witnessed a rash of well-funded Black forward-facing platforms across the political spectrum that have attempted to achieve political and ideological buy-in in Black communities into what our colleague Dylan Rodriguez has described as the domestic war-making enterprise. From your vantage point, how does Blackness configure into the political analysis and organizing strategies against the prison industrial complex?
From my vantage point, and I'm purely speaking as myself here, from my vantage point, it doesn't factor in nearly enough. I think it factors in fairly sloppy ways, kind of in the broadest sense. There are some organizations and some groupings that have really taken up trying to articulate what the specific impacts are on Black communities of a wide variety of political impulses. And then I think there's kind of a very broad brush that gets used by many other groups, many other people. And so there's frequently, I hear assumptions about what Black people want, what Black people need, what Black people will tolerate, that I'm not sure are super well tested out, don't necessarily resonate with my own experience, which is just one experience, but make me curious about how well they've been tested out. And so I think, the question of prison industrial complex abolition is one of those things, right? So we hear frequently, oh God, all kind of madness about it. We hear prison industrial complex is for white people, right? Like Black people don't have time for that. Black people don't want that. We hear that imprisoned people, particularly Black imprisoned people, have no time for that, don't want that. And in my experience, that is not so at all. And that if you actually talk to people about what the politics entail, what they look like in practice, people are like, oh yeah, for sure. I would prefer not to live in a cage than to live in a cage. Oh, for sure. I would prefer to figure out a way to deal with harm when it happens that isn't kind of a hammer to the head at every single turn, right? So that's like one example, but I think there are many examples out there. And you know, we saw a lot of this after the Floyd rebellions, for instance, summer of 2020. Suddenly everybody was telling us all the time what Black people wanted. And I didn't have the sense that a lot of people were asking Black people what we wanted. So I guess my kind of knee-jerk reaction to your question is that I feel like it's not used well enough. And then I will say, to not be flip about that question, I don't mean to be flip about it, that I think there are some organizations and some groupings out there that are being very thoughtful, very rigorous, and very intentional about how Blackness intersects with things like environmental injustice, with things like the prison industrial complex, with things like you know, how the economy is structured and how people participate in the economy, who has access to food and land and shelter, right? And when people are doing that kind of rigorous analysis and, you know, political activity, I've been so impressed by what they're coming up with, because what they're generally coming up with is that the status quo is not going to hold. You know, from the perspective of Black people and what we want. And that there's a lot of intersecting needs between Black people and other communities of color or, you know, marginalized communities. And that there are many, many, many opportunities for us to join forces and, you know, build much more powerful fronts against the people who would do us harm when we can think, you know, strategically like that. And those people are also helping us understand how essential it is for Black people to be internationalists, to continue to be internationalists as Black people have been through the years. So, you know, I think that you know, not to be too reductionistic about it, but I do think that for many Black people, Blackness shapes everything. You know, the fact of being Black shapes how you understand the geography that you exist in. You know, shapes how you understand your gender or your sexuality or your body in the world, right? And so I don't think it can be underestimated, but that doesn't mean that it should be loose and sloppy either. It should just be like a add-on. I think it needs to be understood in relationship to lots of other dynamics. Is that what you were getting at?
Yes, yes. And actually, I have a follow-up question building on the point that you made about internationalism. So, in the wake of the 10th anniversary of Critical Resistance, you co-authored a piece with Isaac Ontiveros, where you stated, this is a quote, our ability to understand where we come from and where we are headed, and to develop new goals, strategies, and tactics is strengthened by engaging critically with related struggles, slave inspection and slavery abolition movements, indigenous resistance to colonization, anti-colonial and third world liberation struggles, both inside and outside the United States, the civil rights movement, labor movements, arts and culture organizing, just to name a few. Our strong affinities with these movements are also rooted in the fact that many people involved in our movement come directly from the ranks of the above mentioned struggles, making these historical connections more than just educational or metaphorical. That's in close quote. To these points, can you expand on how and why an internationalist perspective became critical to your framework of understanding and developing strategies against the prison industrial complex?
Sure, that sounds like us. Those sentences go on and on and on. Um, I think that you know, from my perspective, internationalism it's just essential. I mean, especially if you live inside of the United States. The United States is just one weird MFN place, right? It is just like a really, really odd place. And it is an empire in decline. And I think we do well to understand where we are as a kind of odd place and to look beyond the kind of, you know, made up borders that make the United States, to see kind of where do we have affinities, but also where can we learn lessons from other struggles. So, the United States does not have much figured out. And the left in the United States does not have very much figured out at all. And there are very, very strong movements all across the world of people working under dramatically worse conditions than we have here, or similar conditions to what we have here. And, we get trained to be very kind of narrowly focused in what we understand to be meaningful. And we get trained in the United States to believe that things that happen outside of the geopolitical borders of this place are not relevant to us. And they're incredibly relevant to us, and I think they can be really, really instructive. And there are some interesting experiments, like really big mass experiments. So you think about, some of the big movements coming out of India, or the big movements that are coming out of Brazil or whatever. There's very, very instructive stuff for us, or out of South Africa. And instructive, not just kind of in like, oh, that was an interesting historical example, but instructive in that, there are many organizers working today who could be of service to us, or we could be in a more reciprocal relationship with than we are right now. And getting that perspective from being outside of your block or your town or your state or your country even, helps you put things into perspective, helps you see kind of a broader context for what goes on here. And I think that broader context also then often suggests a broader range of strategies or tactics that you could bring to bear on your specific situation. So I just think, I don't know, it's a very simplistic answer I have, but I just think we're missing out if we don't take advantage of the kind of broad world out there to help us make sense of what goes on locally.
And I can't help but think that a lot of your understanding of the connection between internationalism and the fight against the prison industrial complex comes from a particular type of political education praxis, which, if anybody knows you, knows that that's very key and central to who you are, both as a person, but then also as a thinker and an organizer as well. And in many ways, the framework of this series, the Black Reconstruction as a Portal series, was informed by a series of political education workshops on Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, conducted by the Center for Political Education while you were the director of CPE. Can you please expand on how political education has been critical to the development of your own political analysis, and also how political education has been a crucial aspect of the organizations that you've been a part of?
Yeah, I'm going to say something that may be controversial to some people, because I know sometimes it is, and I'm just going to roll the dice and we'll see how it goes. I want to win. I get into certain kinds of fights and I want to win. I fight to win. And I say that might be controversial because I know there are some dynamics in different movement spaces right now where people feel like the concept of winning is, I don't know, it's too aggressive. I've heard that. I've heard it's too aggressive. I've heard it's too capitalistic in its thinking. I reject both of those things. I think if you get into a struggle, you should want to win. Otherwise, I'm not sure the point of being in that struggle. It just seems a little bit academic to me in that terms, not in terms of the academy. And so to win, you have to be highly skilled. In a lot of the fights that I have been lucky enough to be involved in over the years, we are much smaller, much less resourced, much less powerful than our opponents. And so you have to be really crafty. You have to be able to really think in creative ways. You have to be able to kind of scope things out steps and steps ahead. You have to be able to put tools to unusual purposes. You have to know how to understand your enemy well. You have to be able to identify who your actual enemy is and not just kind of who's annoying you at any given moment. And all of those are skills that you develop if you take political education seriously. So, this I think goes back to the earlier question that you were asking me about movements. I believe in movements, and I believe that movements need to be strong. And I think the best way to make movements strong is to make organizations strong. And I think the best way to make organizations strong is to skill up the people who are inside of them and skill them up in all of the potential ways, right? So teach them organizing basics, teach them movement history, teach them power analysis, teach them foreign language. I don't know, there's like all kind of stuff that I think helps people fight better. And so, I often talk about political education as helping organizations get in their best fighting form. And I mean that very, very seriously. And I think that's the impact that political education has had on me, is really thinking that it is an essential part of doing any kind of political activity well. If you want to avoid making the same mistakes over and over, if you want to get, what is that phrase, a leg up on your opponent, if you want to try to get an advantage on your opponent, you need to have some knowledge, you need to have some skills. And probably I'm gonna say this in a more definitive way. Maybe somebody wants to fight me later, but I don't think there's a way to do that just out of your own personal experience. Personal experience will only get you so far, and people are like, "Well, I'm the expert in whatever." It's like you're the expert in your one little thing, and that might make you the star of your life. It should make you the star of your life, but being an expert in your one little thing probably is not going to, radically transform the conditions of hundreds of thousands of people. So you probably need to do some skill development too. And so I obviously I could go on forever about all of the benefits of political education, but I think it's crucial. And I think people need to take it more seriously. When I was working at Center for Political Education, I was always really surprised by how many organizations would be like, "Oh yeah, we need to do that. We need to study together. Or we need to put together a political education plan." But it was always like a afterthought or an add-on. And I just couldn't help but think, like, you could be winning more stuff, or you could be fighting much more effectively if this was an integrated part of how you thought about doing political activity.
So building off of that, I'd like to just provide a small anecdote within this next question, which was that while working with the Southern California Library located in Los Angeles to conduct political education workshops during what is now increasingly being described as like the Black Lives Matter era. That's roughly 2014 to the current time. There was a glaring opening or void that I witnessed, which was that there was this disconnect between the ontological framework of Black communities in Los Angeles and that of progressive organizations who claim to be speaking for these very communities. And there was a rather infamous moment in one of these workshops. One of the organizers of a very well-known organization was conducting a Know Your Rights training as part of the political education process. And the members of the community took over the training in large part because they stated to the organizer that if we enact these strategies that you're telling us that's supposed to protect us from the police, we in fact are going to get killed. Like what you're telling us is actually going to reproduce harm onto us as opposed to save us in this way. And I was wondering, given this wide gulf, what strategies have you seen implemented or have you implemented yourself to connect these knowledge practices that are already known within communities to movement building?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing about that example is, sometimes people get it wrong, and that's okay. I mean, I think, obviously if it's the difference between you putting yourself at risk and not, then you want the people to know what's going to put you at risk and what's not going to put you at risk, and you want to avoid doing those things. And so it sounds like it was good that people who had more knowledge, took the reins a little bit there and helped reconfigure, what they were learning together. Organizers don't always know what's best, but they don't always get it wrong either, right? And so I think part of that is a push and a pull that needs to happen between human beings, period, regardless of kind of what the sides, if you will, are of the equation. So I think there's trying to think of how to say what I want to say. Sometimes in my experience, over the years, there has been a romanticization of so-called community, right? And I put that in scare quotes because it's used in a very kind of loosey-goosey way. And I've been, guilty of this too. So I'm not trying to disparage anybody here. But it's this kind of amorphous, container that kind of stands in for everything. And there's this kind of romantic idea that people have everything that they need already. It just has to be ignited in them or expressed in them. I don't tend to believe that. I tend to believe that if communities already had everything they needed, then we wouldn't have to struggle to get stuff for our communities. So my sense is that there are people in most of our communities who are really skilled and really knowledgeable, and we should engage with them more often than we probably do as organizers. But not everybody you stop on the street who has an idea has the right idea. And the fact that they're like from the neighborhood doesn't mean that their idea is a good one. So I think, again, to go back to this idea of political education, we need to develop really acute skills. And I mean this as the global we, all of us, need to develop really acute skills at being able to discern the information that we're getting, filter the information that we're getting, and understand what the information is based on, whether or not we trust it, and to know for ourselves why we trust it. Who do we trust? What do we trust? And why? And it might be that we listen to this old guy around the way because over time his analysis has borne out to be right over and over and over. Or we might listen to him because everybody else in the neighborhood listens to him. And so his sway, his leverage over people is meaningful to us. But he might be some old guy who just tells tales and likes people to listen to him, right? And I think all of us probably have somebody like that in our lives who doesn't get enough attention, doesn't get enough credit for what they did over the years, and they just want to tell stories, some of which are made up, maybe most of which feature them as the central hero. And, maybe that's not the guy that gets to tell everybody what to do, right? So I think the issue there is really an issue of knowing. How do we know what we know? And an issue of preparation. So who sent this organizer out with this bad information? And what is their responsibility to, come and correct in the neighborhoods? What's the responsibility of the neighborhood to say, hey, your person this time didn't get it right, but we know that you're interested in getting it right, so we want to work with you to do that rather than just, shaming them or expelling them from the neighborhood too. So I think there's a lot to work with there. And I think the question is, what's the long-term goal? Do we want people in the neighborhood to have better skills and to know what to do when confronted with the violence of policing, for instance, right? And if that's the long-term goal, we want people to be better able to defend themselves against policing, then we need everybody's help in doing that. So we can't just say, oh, this organizer screwed it up this one time, so fuck them and their organization. They don't get to come around anymore, and we're going to talk all kind of crap about them all over town, right? What we need is to say, how did you come to your decision that these are the right things to be teaching us? This is our experience. We know that these things are going to keep us safer. And how can we make sure that you don't keep repeating this bad stuff to people who might not know the difference and then might wind up making themselves more vulnerable rather than more resourced? So I think, like I said, I think there's a lot to work with there, but there has to be a commitment to working in good faith. And I think there has to be a real clarity around what everybody's trying to achieve.
So in thinking about that process itself of working together with a whole bunch of different sort of actors in play, and doing this over the long term. And then you talking about, part of why you have entered into certain campaigns is to win, as well as being very important. Um, if you could sort of put on these hindsight goggles and look back at like many of the contours that the fight against the prison industrial complex has taken, what do you think were some of the missteps or missed opportunities that have occurred? And do you have a concern that some of those same issues are being repeated? And or are you confident that there are concrete channels to sort of pass these lessons learned on to others?
So many missteps, so many wrong turns. We did so much wrong. We did a lot of stuff right, and I mean this in the biggest sense. There's a lot of different players in the movement against the prison industrial complex, and a lot of different political tendencies and a lot of different strands of work. And so when I say we, I mean the biggest we possible. That we've all made a lot of mistakes, and we've also done a lot of good work and gotten some things right. I think the other thing that I guess I'll say is that I'm not sure all of the pitfalls that I have in mind were mistakes. I think, some of those things were, or even missed opportunities. I think some of those things were things that we couldn't exactly get purchase on. We couldn't kind of overcome the obstacles in some of these cases, right? So, for instance, I think one that kind of is on my mind a lot, and has been for a long time, and people have put in really, really good work on, is the kind of divide between places where prisons, for instance, but also jails in some cases, are cited, and the people who get sent to those places. So there's this great divide, and there's a lot of fear mongering that goes on around people who get imprisoned to make locking them in a cage seem like a reasonable thing to do. And there's a lot of mess that people get sold when a county or a city or a state or the federal government wants to put a prison or a jail somewhere. And in that mess is included this kind of mythology about these kind of boogeyman of kind of who imprisoned people are, but also what having a prison in your town might get you, right? And this is like the privatization conversation, debunked a million times over, that prisons are economic drivers for anything anywhere. They are not, point blank, end of. They just aren't. They are drains on any economy that they're put in. But there are still communities across this country, and by that I mean geographic communities, that are fighting to have prisons put where they live. And I think we've never adequately been able to get around that obstacle. I don't think that's our fault. It's not a mistake on anyone's part. It's not a missed opportunity, a single missed opportunity that if only we had gotten in the right place, the right time, we could have messed with that. That mythology is very thoroughgoing, and the machine that produces that mythology is really big and powerful and durable. And I think, we, and again, I'm using we in a very loose way here, but I think that we need more people spending more time in rural communities where prisons, for instance, get cited, and really like spending time in those communities before prisons are actually built, talking to people about why this is not a good thing for them, what they could be advocating for instead. And there are some people who do this incredibly well. I will say the name out loud, Craig Gilmore, because he's exemplary at doing this and has taught a lot of people over the years how to do this well. But more people need to be doing that work. And we can see, when people put in the work to do that, it's often really, really effective. And, up and down the state of California, recently in Kentucky, where they fought off yet another federal prison. There are lots of good examples of this working, and these kind of rural urban divides that get made by people who cite prisons, I think could be broken down a bit more. So that's a thing. I think we haven't completely figured out how to get away from the boutique imprisonment craze, prisons or jails for children or for women or for so-called mental health, as if mental health could be provided in a locked environment like that. But I think we haven't kind of been able to get under that impulse and make a good enough case for why it's just garbage. And I think that goes on. Today they keep, you live close to LA. LA loves that stuff, right? LA loves to make specialty jails in particular. Around my way up here in Harlem, they're trying to build a so-called feminist jail, which is just like a laughable thing to think about. And these two places are not unique. That is a scheme that gets used a lot to justify having to build more cages, new cages, when I think we know that the people who they're trying to serve would be best served outside of cages, period. So those are a few of these kind of tough nuts that I don't think we've cracked exactly, particularly around imprisonment. Around policing, there's so many. And I feel like the real energy around particularly the abolition of policing is much more recent. And again, I'm happy to debate that with somebody who knows more than I do, but I in my experience, that's a more kind of recent development that's taking a lot more coherent shape and isn't just kind of individual fits and starts in different places. And in its newness, I think there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of lessons to learn there about how policing works, about how deeply ingrained the logic of policing is in U.S. culture. And just about how shady and how much of a bag of liars cops are. They will lie. They're allowed to lie in their jobs, and they will lie in these kind of political fights too. And so again, I don't think that those are sets of mistakes exactly, but I think those are really, really big challenges and obstacles that we need to get around. I think we have made some mistakes though too. I think I'll speak for my little mini generation, which Gen Xer, we're small but ornery. So, I think my generation did not do a great job of really engaging elders in our movement to really learn some good lessons. And that's a thing I do see repeated. I think younger generations don't do nearly enough to kind of go back and talk to previous generations about this very stuff. And it's like, what did you try? Why didn't that work? Or do you think it would work now, even if it didn't work then? And really trying to figure out how to not make the same mistakes over and over and over, or, just continually bump up against the same obstacles without being able to push them anywhere else. So I think that's a big mistake. There's a lot of really important thinkers, and I don't mean like famous, I mean like crucial to our movements, important thinkers inside and outside of cages, who have been doing this work for a very long time. And I don't think that we've sufficiently engaged them in doing cross-generational education. So that's a thing. I could go on all night about like all of the issues, but I want to get to this other part of your question too, which is if I think that there are mechanisms in place now. I'm really, really concerned about the state of the movement against the prison industrial complex. I think there's a lot of new energy. A lot of people got energized, particularly after 2020, particularly after 2014. There are these surges in interest. And I am encouraged by the fact that each one of these cycles that the organizing seems to start from a progressively better place, better from my perspective place. So if I look at 2020, the demands compared to 2014, they're dramatically better demands coming out of Minneapolis than we saw initially coming out of St. Louis or Baltimore, for instance. But I also don't feel like there's enough strategy, and that there's not enough coherent strategy. You know, there's like lots of little strands of work that appears from my vantage point to be happening independently of the others. and I'm not suggesting everybody needs to get together under a single like national campaign. I don't think that makes sense. Excuse me, given how the prison industrial complex operates at all of these different scales, like I was talking about earlier. But I do think that a more integrated movement, a movement that recognizes itself more self-consciously as a unified movement, could really leverage more power than these kind of individual strains. And so I think there is a movement. So I'm not gonna, fall into that age old. I don't know if she's changed her tune on this, but Michelle Alexander for years was saying there was no national movement. And I always took exception to that. I think there is a national movement, but I think it's not as coherent, as powerful, as aligned as it could be. And I think it needs to not fight itself. It needs to not fight over, whether or not, for instance, abolitionist politics are legitimate to mobilize around or not. I think it needs to understand that there's a spectrum of politics, a spectrum of strategies and tactics, and that they can operate in a somewhat coherent way without trying to jack each other up all the time. And so I feel very concerned about that. And I don't think that there are a lot of mechanisms out there right now that are helping the movement cohere, that are, sharing strategies. I use strategy in the wrong way there. Sharing methods by which a movement could become more coherent, could develop a more kind of aligned set of politics to operate around. So I have a lot of concern about that. And, I think there are a lot of people out there who, in my experience, are taking on the politics as an identity rather than operating from the politics to win. And that concerns me a great deal as well.
So in thinking about the connection between the sort of the movement building that happened after 2014, after 2020, and even going back before then, right? We take it back to 1980s and 90s. So what you can see at every single turn, and you talked about this with the attempted buildup of this feminist jail in New York, are these reforms which sort of come about in order to placate these campaigns that are making concrete demands upon several different actors, state actors, non-state actors, in order to make social relationships much safer, in order to change the material and cultural landscape of spaces as well. And in the wake of what happened in St. Louis, in particular in Ferguson, Missouri, you wrote, and this is somewhat one of those long quotes again, so bear with me, quote, making incremental changes to the systems, institutions, and practices that maintain systematic oppression and differently target marginalized communities is essential to shifting power. Taking aim at specific aspects and demanding change helps build power among repressed communities in ways that are more lasting and sustainable. Without a strategic long-term vision for change, however, today's reforms may be tomorrow's tools of repression, close quote. And that was specifically talking about reform in the sort of problematic nature of reform. So I would like to ask a two-part question with regards to reform. The first is, do you feel an accurate assessment of specific sort of popular, and I'm using movements here with air quotes, is that they're merely social media promotions aimed at attracting capital, became the embodiment of reforms that you so eloquently described in your 2015 piece that I just quoted from, have become sort of used as tools of repression in that same way. And so what I'm thinking about here are the ways in which oftentimes you see people claiming victories, winning under the banner of a reform. And that reform could be lauding the building of a feminist jail, or it could be passing a proposition in the state that on the surface looks like it's ending the school to prison pipeline. But as soon as you begin to dig in the numbers, you find that it's actually funneling all types of money and resources to fund campus security officers on school campuses, right? And people come out and be like, we won this, right? So that's what I'm thinking in those terms. Second, given what I would say is the dilution of the term abolition, do you think reform via the formal political apparatus is still a viable option for undoing the prison industrial complex? Or should we be situating reform that is in the context of incremental steps specifically outside of the formal political structure?
That's an interesting question. And interesting in part because I think it's not typically how I think about reform, like inside or outside of the formal political structure. So I have to put my brain on that a little bit. On this first question, just about what you can claim as a victory. That one's challenging, right? Because like I said, I like to win. And I think we also need to say loudly when we do win, when we get something that we've been fighting for. We need to do it for ourselves, to remind ourselves that, the struggle is worth something. And we need to do it for our opponents to remind them, hey, we got you this time. That being said, and I think this is more about, how we fight. My answer is more about how we fight than what we claim, what we call a victory or not. I think we need to be very, very cautious. Not to the point of being frozen and not acting, but I think we need to be cautious about what we fight for. What are we setting our sights on? And because, let me say this a different way, because if your goal is to win a feminist jail, then that's a victory for you. You did win that, right? So you should claim that as a victory. That would not be my goal, for instance. And so I think if we are people who have a long-term vision that includes the abolition of the prison industrial complex, then it's up to us to be very thoughtful, very mindful about not compromising that long-term vision for what might seem like a short-term win, right? And there are lots of ways of winning in the short term. So I think, we get dinged sometimes. Prison industrial complex abolitionists get dinged sometimes for only having a long-term vision that's not practical in the short term or whatever, right? That abolition is not pragmatic, or it's not possible in the short term. And so you get people saying weird stuff like, well, I'm done with your politics, but until then. It's like, there's no until then. It's like, you make the until then. So all of the stuff that we're thinking about as we think about this long-term vision has to add up to that long-term vision, right? And there is no magical switch that we're going to flip and suddenly abolition, right? We make the conditions for prison industrial complex abolition. We do that through campaigning. And so all of the steps that we take along the way, these abolitionist steps, need to amount to or lead us down the path toward, or whatever, language you like to use there, need to add up to what we want. They can't add up to, something that sends us completely in a different direction or gets us something that we don't ultimately want. So we need to be very thoughtful about what we're asking for and how we're getting there. And I do not mean by that we should be very purist in, like it has to be this like airtight, so-called abolitionist goal, because there is no such thing, right? We are human beings who live in the world, and stuff is messy. And so we need to be able to handle mess even as we move closer and closer toward our political goal. But again, this is a place where, some rigorous political education and developing really, really strong analytical skills can help us, right? So we can read a bill and we can say to ourselves, okay, this, and this is what's in this bill. What happens if we win this, and this, right? And we saw this around like Proposition 47, for instance, in California, right? Which looked really good on paper to a lot of people. And then you get into the not so fine print and it's like, oh yeah, and we're going to give a bunch more money to school cops. And we're going to give, this whole category of people no chance ever of getting out of prison. And it's like, okay, then that's not for us. Even if you get to switch some of these charges from felonies to misdemeanors, which is a very, very good thing and may get a bunch of people out of prison, it's not good if we're also funneling a bunch of money to the cops and we're securing, the fate of a bunch of other people who are currently in prison. And I don't think that we need to fall for either ors in this case either. That's like a policy trap that I don't think we need to fall into. So I think we can say yes to making all of these things misdemeanors, and yes to making a case for these people to be eligible for reconsideration, under some system, and yes to depriving cops of resources ever, right? Money into schools, but into the hands of cops, never. All of those things are possible, but we have to be paying attention to what's in these pieces of legislation, if the terrain of legislation is where we fight. And so I think, in the case of, these feminist jails, for instance, the late great Rose Browse, wrote a series of pieces talking about why the idea of a feminist prison was ludicrous and why we should never advocate for it, right? And she and some other organizers really took these academics to task, and it had been academics who had been putting forward this theory that specialty prisons would benefit people who get locked up in them. And we're making at some level real cases, right? So like when you lock people up in a gender specific prison and you put somebody in there who doesn't meet that gender, oftentimes they don't get access to all of the things that are in there, right? So you don't get programming, you might not get health care, you might not get, the things that you need, you might not get yard time. But these organizers argued, I think incredibly convincingly, that the response to that is not just to build up more and more cages, but is to figure out how to keep these people who you want to put into this situation out of prisons to begin with. And there are lots of ways to do that. And I feel like I'm starting to go far afield from what you asked me initially, Damien, so I'm sorry. But I think, on the kind of fundamental question of reform, I don't think we need to imagine reform as an on or off switch, right? Either we're against reform or we're for reform. I think, we have to think about what is our end goal. And if our end goal is the elimination of the prison industrial complex, then we can make small changes that get us closer to that erode the power and the legitimacy of the system, that help change the common sense about punishment, right? All of these are incremental steps. They're not the whole kind of shebang at once. And that's, I guess, partly what I'm talking about with these kind of purist goals. if every single prison door could open today, if we could make that happen, yes, do it, go for it. I am not somebody who's like, no, 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 we have to carefully sketch out, who, when, which door at what time, all of that. It's like, if we have the ability to do that, we should do that today. Because even though we're not 100% prepared to take people home, we will do better than what they're getting in cages today. So we should do. But, history has shown us that we don't have very many opportunities to just kind of open everything all at once, if we get any at all. And so we have to think about, again, how to live in the world. And in the world, what we can do and what we do pretty effectively is chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away, right? But we want to figure out how to chip away such that the edifice gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And it's not, just kind of chipping away here to build up, another fortress over here, right? So the kind of very simplistic way that I talk about this a lot is just, we don't want to build up anything we're just going to have to tear down later. And I think that's my orientation toward reform. I don't think it's just bad, but I think we need to think about changes toward our long-term vision. Our long-term vision always has to be in place if we're going to advocate for incremental change. And again, sometimes we mess up, right? So when we mess up, we don't claim those as victories, but we do our best to keep moving in the direction of what we want and not, settle for what we think we can get.
All right, so you had mentioned academics, and this is my last question to you, and it's one I've been dying to ask, which is directly related to the academy. One of the more pernicious developments during the advent of the modern prison industrial complex has been the complicity of the academy to the development, maintenance, and enhancement of the prison industrial complex itself, ranging from the development of predictive policing schemes emanating out of anthropology and criminology departments to the providing of key theories out of sociology and poli-sci departments that have informed policing policy. The tentacles of academia have been ever present within the prison industrial complex. Regarding the connection between the academy and the prison industrial complex, I have two questions for you. The first, if it is all possible, how can we organize and or develop effective theorization from within the confines of the Western Academy structure? And second, have you seen effective strategies to root out and make plain the violence-making capacity of the Western Academy, which you were alluding to in that piece by Ross himself?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the first question is more a question for you, right? It's like, what can you and your homies get up to, right? And I'm going to think about it some more. I'm not just going to be jokey about it, but I do feel like at some level that is a question for academics to figure out, right? On the other side of that, I've seen some interesting stuff. I feel like there are a lot of protections for academics that provide a buffer from organizers, right, who would like to critique them or whatever, so-called that magical community member out there that I was referring to earlier, to be able to critique them. And I'm not a fan of call outs exactly and shaming, public shaming and that kind of thing. So I know there have been some attempts to do that, right? So to show up and say, hey, you, whatever, criminology lab, we know that you are developing this kind of theory that's going to make policing even more violent than it already is, for instance. Or we know that you're working with X and X nonprofit and they're giving you cover to test out all of this crap on the streets that's really, really dangerous for people, right? So we've seen those kinds of things. I think those can be effective, but they're not my favorite. I feel like they don't last. They give you this flash in this moment, but then, people come back around and are sneakier the next time or whatever, harder to kind of ferret out. I think that there have been some interesting organizing efforts on campuses that have the potential to engage academics, to engage university professionals of all sorts, faculty and staff, in participating in them in ways that really can shift how people understand their own roles or understand what they contribute to the problems more generally. And so I'm thinking about a whole range of them. So, there were, particularly during Occupy, for all of you old heads in the room, I know there are going to be some young people who don't remember Occupy, but especially during Occupy, there was a lot of activity on college campuses, university campuses across the country during Occupy, and a lot of, both kind of student, faculty, staff formations, that integrated people from all different parts of the institution, and really made a case for uncovering, a university's investments, for instance, or their labor policies, or, other kind of economic things about the institution. And those kind of joint efforts I thought were really, really interesting at raising up some of the fundamental contradictions of the institution, and really pressing on those contradictions, making them kind of untenable contradictions. So that comes to mind. There have been a variety of police off-campus kinds of campaigns, including, I know there's a recent one, right, that's going on right now, that I know very little about, other than that it exists. But historically, there have been, and I'm talking about recent history here, campaigns to try to make university campuses, college campuses, no-go zones for the cops of the cities in which they're based, and try to prevent there from being school cops as well, and then understanding how to set up different kinds of supports that might help students in the absence of that, those institutions. And I think those are really interesting too. I think there are roles for theorists to play in those campaigns. And if you really get into thinking about what it means to remove, this violent institution from your campus, and you can apply your professional skills to that, I think those could be really effective too. People who organize on campuses, I'm sure, would have a lot more smart stuff to say about this than I do, because I don't organize on campuses. But I think there's a lot of possibility there. And I think that, ignoring academics, or, pushing them all into the bad bin, and saying there's nothing that they can provide movements, is just throwing a bunch of tools into the garbage. And like I was saying earlier, it's like, I don't want to throw any tool into the garbage. I want all of those to be at the ready. So if there's somebody who's really good at researching, or there's somebody who's really good at understanding statistics, or there's somebody who's really, really good at understanding how to communicate ideas, or there's somebody who, a legislator will pay attention to when they won't pay any attention to me, then I want all of those things to be available to me. And I think, maybe to go back to the initial question you asked, what academics need to do is to ask how they could be of service to movements, and not, only just kind of wait until an invitation is made, but, the same way that organizers do. You join something, you figure out how to be of service, and then you contribute what you can. You don't try to take it over. You don't try to, redefine somebody's strategy, but you figure out how you can apply what your skills are to what the problem is at hand. And I think whatever, it seems like a really, really basic organizing question to me at some level. Like, what can they do? They can get to work on the problem. They can act with humility. They can contribute.
Well, thank you very much for that. I don't know how to say thank you enough in different ways, formats. Learn, as always, a tremendous amount from you, which I'm very appreciative. I'm sure everybody who's been participating with us is also very appreciative as well. I think we have a few questions from the participants, which Yusuf is going to ask of you. And I'm also cognizant of time because it is getting late where you are, so we don't want to keep you all night. So I'll allow Yusuf to have some of the questions that were pulled from the participants.
All right, thank you, Damien, and thank you, Rachel, for this really fantastic conversation. You covered so much ground. We've got a number of great questions from members of the audience, and they're still coming in, so please feel free to add your question to the Q&A stack there. Maybe we can start with this one, and this question says, what kinds of strategies can we engage to deal with claims to community, especially organizing around abolition and the prison industrial complex? We find a contestation around who represents the Black community, say, who knows how to best help Black folk, and even how, if we should move beyond prisons and police. Basically, how do we deal with those who claim to represent Black folks and appear to have the legitimacy to do so, and who actively work against the abolitionist movement?
That's a hard question, a complicated question. So let me see what I might have to say about this. And Damien, I would love to hear what you think about this also. I think, I don't know. The question of what we do with people is always like a really tricky question for me. I'm like, they have different ideas. We're not trying to do anything to them necessarily. I think maybe it's more properly understood as like, how do we have a good contest of ideas here? How can we have our ideas win the day rather than like, what do we do with these people? And, my answer to that, I'm just going to be a broken record on, you already heard, which is like, get your analysis right, like understand, your movement history, understand the analysis of your time and place and conditions, and be able to leverage that against what you think are bad ideas, right? So, the other thing is that you might not be the voice of Black people either, right? So the question might be more like, how do we unearth, what's really going on in Black communities? Black communities are incredibly broad and diverse and big, like there's a lot of different ways of being Black, right? So, I think when I hear, for instance, politicians try to speak on behalf of the Black community, I get kind of riled up and I'm like, I wish you wouldn't do that. It's like, you definitely are not speaking for me. And I think, my answer, which is not a great answer, so Damien's going to come in and save the day, but my answer, which is not a great answer, is that I think we have to figure out how to challenge the ideas such that we can make a better case for what we think is a more appropriate answer, right? So if we think that, the question referenced abolitionist politics, for instance, right? So if we think that abolitionist politics are good for Black people, should be for Black people, then one, we have to make the case for why. We have to demonstrate that, Black people don't need to be alienated by these politics. And that is more than just talking. I think that has to be showing too. We have to launch campaigns for using those politics, and we have to win some of those campaigns. But also, I think we need to help people understand how to articulate that for themselves, right? So that, a politician can't come in, I can't come in, Damien can't come in and just claim to speak for everybody, right? People have to have encouragement to articulate what's on their minds, what they care about, what drives them themselves, and they need to have opportunities to be able to do that. So that's kind of a sloppy answer, and Damien's gonna tighten everything up for me and make it plain, right?
Well, all I'm gonna do is just use what you've been saying in part the whole time, which is that political education is key. And In particular, I think about the work of our colleague, Sonia Vasborges, um, who writes about education being a critical component to the building up of a mass organizing movement in Guinea-Bissau to win, to liberate themselves. And crucial in Sonia's text is that you see that there's various groups of people who all don't consider themselves to be Black, or who all don't consider themselves to be whatever it is that someone else thinks that they are. And the key behind this thrust was to develop a particular educative platform which brought about an ethos of interest together, where people could understand, like, oh, we all have a similar goal, right? And how do we get to this goal? And thus, along the way, you begin to unpack, well, what does Blackness mean? What does it mean to go against the colonial state? What if I identify with the colonial state? All these tensions begin to get thrust out, but that's a process in of itself. And it demands, to your point, Rachel, that you stated over and over again, that you really have to work with people to see exactly where they stand, because you just have this thought, you meaning the amorphous you, that Black people don't get down with the prison industrial complex until you begin to talk with Black people and be like, yeah, like this all makes sense to me. And so, yeah, I would just come back to that. Political education is key. It takes a lot of time and effort. It's not going to be flashy. You're not going to be able to post it on Twitter, on Instagram, all of the details. But that's nothing new at all. Like, that's been the case. A lot of the hard work that goes into movement building is not fun in that way that you see in a reward the next day or tomorrow. But slowly over time, I think that's the case. And then secondly, I think that I learned this a lot from Yusuf Omawali and Michelle Welsling at the Southern California Library, is that we need popular propaganda, like, on our side, in order to see how this is cohesive, and that these ideas resonate well because they in fact are already present in the communities. Like, the idea that policing should not be in a community is already there, right? It's not that you're introducing that idea to a community and you have to get them to accept it. It's once you put it in this popular form, you'd be like, oh yeah, I've been thinking that, right? And then that begins to gain cohesion as well. So I think there's several strategies that can be done, but I mean, literally throughout your whole discussion, Rachel, you hit already on literally all of them.
I knew I could rely on you. I think the one last thing I'll mention is that I also think it's foolhardy to assume you're going to get all Black people to agree to anything ever, right? So even in this example you were just given, Damien, if all of these people in the neighborhood are like, oh yeah, I was already thinking that, there's going to be some old lady who's like, no, more cops, right? Absolutely more cops. There will never be probably 100% consensus among any group of people. And I think, this is part of the trick here that we were talking about earlier when we were talking about people speaking for the community, is this idea that, it's possible to get all Black people on board with the same thing, regardless of all of the differences in the communities that we already talked about.
Great. We've got a couple questions that touch on a somewhat similar theme. Let's call it coalition building, or building with other communities, potentially internationally, which was a theme already that you touched on in depth in the conversation. So I'm going to group these two together. The first one asks, in what ways can we make the resistance from the PIC more inclusive? How is this applicable internationally? And the other related question asks, what is the way critical resistance goes about finding shared interests without compromising the end goal to end the prison industrial complex? And or how do people working to end the prison industrial complex from different geographical, institutional, and social locations bring their work together to further the goal of ending the prison industrial complex? What are the interests that needs to be foregrounded to even move in the same direction together?
Dang, these are big questions. Y'all are like got big brains on this seminar. I think the first part confused me a little bit. How to make resistance to the prison industrial complex more inclusive. I feel like it's a very, very inclusive fight already. It incorporates people from cities in the country, it incorporates people from inside and outside of locked institutions, and incorporates people across genders and across sexualities and across geography. It is a big movement, and it is a very varied movement. So I'm not sure exactly what to say about that, but I think the kind of like basic organizing thing to say about that is probably that if you want to continue to build mass, you have to figure out how to speak to what people are most interested in, right? So you have to figure out like what's at stake for any group that might not be there that you'd like to have involved, and how can you tell them about their stakes and why getting involved in the fight would be beneficial to them. I will not and cannot speak on behalf of Critical Resistance. I don't work with them, so I'm not going to say anything about that. But the like how to get everybody involved in stuff, that is also like it's huge. And I think it's maybe a similar answer, which is that you have to figure out what people's shared interests are, and I can't tell you this is what they are universally, because they differ. So if you're trying to figure out, for instance, how to get people to stop calling the cops, right? That was a project that I worked on some years ago, worked in neighborhoods to discourage people from calling emergency services and figuring out what they could do instead. And so what we did there was to be in conversation with people. Under what circumstances have you called the police, or would you call the police? And then when we started having those conversations, it was interesting because a lot of the reasons that people were calling the cops had to do nothing to do with so-called crime, had to do more with health, right? I live with my elderly parent, and sometimes we need help, and I call an ambulance and the cop shows up first, right? Or had to do with fear of the unknown, right? So I saw somebody sleeping on my front walk. I didn't know who they were, so I called the cops, right? But also when we started talking about the variety of ways that people could deal with this stuff that may not involve calling the cops, people were really, really open to that. So I think we need to figure out what's at stake for people, and not like make promises that we can't keep. That's not what I mean, but really to broaden our sense of who the issue touches, because I think sometimes organizers, we can get a little narrow in thinking about kind of who's interested in this issue and why, and not only people who have a lot of power, but who does this issue touch? And an issue like the prison industrial complex touches everybody, right? Like I can't think of anybody who's completely untouched by that issue, right? If you think about all of those tentacles of the prison industrial complex I talked about earlier, right? And if we think about like all of the kind of cultural apparatus that's incorporated in keeping that system alive, you can't turn on your television without seeing a cop show, right? Or having the option to see a cop show. So there is no one, I would venture a guess that there is no one who is completely untouched in some form or fashion by it. And so the goal for us, the job for us as organizers, is to figure out how to help them see their own stake in the fight and help them care enough about the outcome of the fight to get involved and put some work into shifting things. I think that's both questions. That's like a little dance around both questions. Does that seem right? Okay.
That was great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we had, one or two others that were talking about solidarity building between across movements and international work, but I think you touched on that quite nicely. Here's another question that asks, how can our deliberate disengagement in political processes, such as voting, so disengagement, be useful in abolition movements? Or is our disengagement to voting an example of throwing tools away?
I would say from my perspective, in my opinion, wholesale disengagement is throwing tools away. I don't see any point in wholesale disengagement. Just like, well, we're not going to vote. The end. And I will say this as a person who for very many years was just like, screw that system. There's no point in engaging in that system. And I think the conditions have shifted. I think, the conditions that we live in today require us to participate, in part because the right is mobilizing, the far right in particularly, is mobilizing at every single level and really, really is organized, right? So, you might think, who cares who's the president? And I would challenge that. I think it does matter. I think we've seen over the past few years that while it might be degrees, there are differences in degree, and those differences in degree do have some impact on our day-to-day lives. But I guess I would challenge you also to think about, like, who's on your school board, who's on your water board, who's on your elections board, right? Like, what are the, and these are different place to place, obviously, but the people who make decisions about what happens in your town on a daily basis, they have a lot of power. Who's the attorney general of your state, right? That's like one of the offices that the far right is really going for because they control elections, right? And so, who sits in those seats actually does matter. And the vehicle that we have at our disposal right now is voting, right? And it's a very imperfect vehicle. And so I'm not suggesting that, that answers all of our problems. But opting out, doesn't punish anybody. It just takes you out of the mix. And so I would say, there may be elections that are not worth your time to participate in. You might decide, like, I don't care about X, Y, and Z. If you live in a state with propositions, you're probably never going to have one of those because there's always something that matters on the ballot. But, in other places that might not be the case. And I think, if you decide that on a case by case basis, you might find that, you can use that strategically. But I think a wholesale opt out, I just think it's like it's throwing tools in the trash. And I don't know that I think that is specific to movements for the prison industrial movement for the abolition of the prison industrial complex. I think that's kind of politics across the board. So I don't think there's anything particular about the movement to abolish the prison industrial complex that would make voting or not voting different from what I just described.
Right. We have two relatively concrete questions, and they're short. The first one asks, what is one group or organization that models abolition to you? What practices do they enact? And how does it relate to the core principles of abolition? I know you're just speaking about some concrete experiences, but this could be your own organization, another organization. And another one asks, what are your thoughts on ACA 3 in California to remove forced labor in jails?
All right. So the first thing, I don't know, I'm not trying to be difficult, but the question of an organization that models abolition, I don't think there is such a thing. I don't think you model abolition. I think you organize for the abolition of the prison industrial complex. So it's not a set of values, it's political principles that you have to organize for. So I think there are some organizations that are more effective at doing that than others. But I guess I just reject the terms of that question. In terms of ACA 3, I will be completely honest with you. Since I left California, I pay very little attention to California politics. I am not familiar with ACA 3. So I don't know, Damien, do you have an opinion about the bill?
You're muted, Damien.
Sorry. I do, but it's going to take the conversation in a different way, but it aligns with the conversation about the feminist jail in New York as well, which is that they're just concerns that have to be meted out with respect to what are the driving forces that are within proposals, right? And similarly to how there was a little bit of a groundswell when Prop 47 was on the horizon, until a couple of organizations really began to look into it to figure out like what was happening and where resources were going. I feel like the same energy has to be put into ACA3 as well, right? But so I'll just leave it at that. Like I said, this could go on for a while about that, but I'm gonna stop there.
Right. And I know we've already had some questions about internationalism from Damien and others. We've got some comrades joining us or who do work in Brazil as well. So I want to encourage everyone here, if you have questions, don't be shy. We've got a lot coming in. Probably won't be able to get to all of them, but please keep them coming. One question I know that I wanted to get to was a follow-up about political education that you talked a lot about already, but wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the study group that you helped organize on Black Reconstruction. How did that come about? And what lessons has that book offered to your organizing? Can you tell us what you see as the relationship, the similarities or differences between political education and kind of formal school education?
I'm just going to make myself a note here so I don't forget all of the parts. Okay, so in 2017, the Center for Political Education, let me say this differently. In 2016, the Center for Political Education underwent a bit of a rejuvenation. It decided to kind of remake itself in some senses. And I was hired with another person Damien mentioned earlier, Isaac Ontiveros, to take over co-direction of the kind of new project. And one of the first things that we did was to talk to a lot of people. This is a San Francisco Bay Area based organization. So we talked to people all across the Bay Area to find out what was on their minds, what did they care about, what was animating their work. And I don't know if you remember the very end of 2016, beginning of 2017, there was a couple of things that were really on a lot of people's minds. And one of the things that kept coming up was Black Reconstruction. You know, people kept saying to us, I wish we would have read Black Reconstruction as an organization. Or, we're going to start reading Black Reconstruction. And I was just like, this is bananas. You know, that's a long book. That's like a hard, long book. It's just like organizers kind of unsolicited from us telling us over and over and over they wanted to engage with this book. And, you know, I think they wanted to engage with it because there are a lot of lessons from the Reconstruction period that were, I think, relevant and resonant with what was happening in the United States, the end of 2016, the beginning of 2017. So we held a study group and we had 50 people sign up to be in this study group with us. And every other week, we read a chapter or a couple chapters. And we did that for, the better part of 3 months, I think. And nearly every single person finished the group together. So, you know, nearly 50 organizers read all of those pages together, got through those long, very, very detailed descriptions of, you know, Senator X and Senator Y doing these things. And we would also incorporate guests into the study group who could talk about kind of contemporary resonances to what was going on in the book to help organizers think about how to apply lessons. So the study group was set up for organizers and was set up explicitly to draw lessons from the book for their contemporary fights. And then we did a one-day series of sessions that Damien participated in as part of the Howard Zinn Book Fair in San Francisco. And we took some of the key themes from the book that we had talked about in our study group and, did independent sessions on them. So we did one on education, we did one on land, we did one on messing up now. There are two more, and I can't remember what they are. Political power and repression, maybe. I can't remember what they all were. And we brought people from different places, academics and organizers, together to come and talk to us about kind of, what was going on for them. And we raised up some of the things that we thought were interesting from the book for that. And, I think there are a lot of themes that are resonant there. I think that the theme of political power and how political power is not only built, but how it's maintained is really, really crucial for our fights today. I think the kind of idea of collectivity and what, must be built and maintained around our collective power is really important. I think the issue of self-determination is really crucial coming out of that book. And I think, the idea of Black people as protagonists in our own struggles, in our own histories, is really, really essentially important across all of those different themes, so that Black people are at the kind of helm of directing our own history, and Du Bois' turn of making, discussing slaves as workers and also discussing slaves as active participants in the Civil War, I think is, such a relevant and important turn and a different way of thinking about that history. And I just think there's so much to learn from that. I could talk about that all night, but maybe we can squeeze in one more if I shut it.
Well, there's one just very brief question that I think is inviting you to speculate and dream. What does the future of Black internationalism look like to you?
Mercy. Y'all like them big. Okay, what does the future of Black internationalism look like to me? Okay, I'm not going to tell a real story about the future. I am going to tell a made-up story about what my ideal future would be, because I'm not a good prognosticator. I have no idea what the future of Black internationalism will be. What I wish it would be is a lot of what I described earlier. I wish that we would have bigger, more powerful movements that are not bound by geopolitical borders, but that expand across time and space in ways that really help us uncover, some of the roots of the problems that Black communities across the diaspora on the continent continue to face. And a lot of these are really durable and long-lasting problems. And so I would like to see us really dedicate some more collective effort to getting at the heart of some of these things, and then developing strategy to win. I stay wanting to win. So that's the future for me, is that we're looking at I can't even think of a word to describe it. I'm thinking about Pan-Africanism, but globally, something that incorporates the diaspora in a meaningful way and doesn't make it kind of, ephemera to the continent, but really thinks about what is dynamic in terms of our relationships across all of these expanses. Damien, I want to hear your answer to that too.
Oh, that's a tough one. I think in particular because I had been more optimistic that there was like a turn that would have happened already by this point, that we sort of could point to as saying like, oh, these are some models that maybe we could follow. But it just hasn't happened, I think, as yet. However, I think part of my optimism is is in the fact that what I see in younger generations of people who are coming from all over the diaspora is like this relentless urgent desire to change the way that things are. And so that as much as like sometimes I get down on things, I also have to recognize that the conversations that were had 20 years ago, the explanations that had to be made 20 years ago don't have to be made. You can walk into a room and now that everybody's on the same page, but you just don't have to explain things to that great degree. People are like, yeah, getting rid of prisons makes sense. Like that's pretty simple, right? And that's from all over the world, right? Like you talk to um, organizers who are working in favelas in Brazil, and they have the exact same response. Like people understand that the police have got to go. Like that's nothing that you necessarily have to tease out piece by piece in ways that maybe 20 years prior needed to be done. So I keep that in mind, and maybe I mean, miss more so maybe I have to change my own thinking about what does change actually look like. Maybe it's not going to be something that's like done in this massive way, but incrementally, you can see how things are happening. And to the point that you made earlier, like capitalism is crumbling all around us, and it's just a matter of when you have these crises, how do you take advantage of those moments and sort of fill in the gaps as well.
Yeah,
Um,
if I can make one little
yeah,
plug
yeah, yeah, for sure.
on what you just said. Thank you for talking about what's different from, even 20 years ago, because I agree. I think it is different. And the plug I want to make is that thank your local organizer. It is through organizing that those shifts happen. Those shifts didn't just happen because some people wrote a good book or had a good idea and talked about it on social media. That happened through organizing. Organizers showing up, making the case, launching campaigns, doing the work. And so, there is, I mean, I guess this takes us back to the beginning, right? Like, there is no change without movements. There is no change without organizers. So, anytime that you can like show up somewhere, say, I believe in prison industrial complex abolition, and they don't laugh you out the room and say, please shut up about that. That's science fiction. You have organizers to thank for that. And so I can't say that enough.
All right, so I think that's a good way to end. To thank your local organizer. That's a good farewell statement. Always. So first, I would like to thank the UCI Humanity Center for hosting us. Thank you for the hard work of Mayor Rowland, Marilyn Grubb Brisk, um, Timmy Famadu, of course, my colleague, partner in crime, Yusuf Abalushi, as well. This has been like a dream come true to have this conversation with Rachel Herzing. When Yusuf and I were applying for this grant, you were one of the first names that popped up. Just like, oh, we gotta talk with Rachel. How can we sort of get Rachel into a conversation, trying to work out different ways of making it happen? And I know, me personally, I'm just sort of like over the moon happy that we got to have this 2-hour time block to share with you. I think your insights, as always, have been brilliant. Looking forward to having future conversations with a whole bunch of people who are able to watch this. And I know this is going to spur on conversation in classes at Irvine, but then also the goal is, to put it up on Black Reconstruction as a portal website, and then point people in direction to do part of that work of political education work to just introduce these key concepts, the sites of terrain in terms of what's been struggled over. And we would really hope to build on the work that you have been doing for such a long time and the organizations that you have been working with for such a long time as well. All that to say is that I'm just very thankful for you and for the time that you shared with us. And I'm just at a loss, I guess, to say how appreciative I am of this moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody who's been working on Black Reconstruction as a portal. Such an important study that you all are taking up together. Super grateful. This is the inaugural one of these conversations, is that right?
So this is our third
The third one.
seminar that we've had, and this is what we're calling our keynote seminar, but it's the first one that we've had on Zoom. and thus by far, I think as a result of that is the largest in terms of how the information will spread as well. So yeah,
Thank you all for the invitation. It's been great to be in conversation with you, Damien, and I'm really excited to learn what will happen with the seminar as it progresses.
Well, thank you. I mean, like I said before, the work that you did at CPE laid the groundwork for the idea of having Black Reconstruction as a sort of a tool of analysis to understand the situation. So thank you many times over. All right, and with that, thank you all who have been attending. Really appreciative of sharing your time with us. And please check out Black Reconstruction as a portal site for future events. We have one with Dr. Antonio Tamas coming up next month. Yeah, and thank you.